Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am joined today by Professor Jeffrey Sachs to discuss what is happening in Europe. As only 15 years ago, it was common to argue that, not by many, but by few, that this century would belong to the Europeans. And now, of course, we're seeing economic decline, social problems, political instability, very dangerous war enthusiasm. There's a complicity to genocide, fueling the Ukraine war in this moralistic hysteria, military Keynesianism, very terrifying language coming out of the governments. And as our common friend Yanis Varoufakis said, it's becoming the stupid continent. So it does seem as if a lot of this, but not everything, intensified with the Ukraine war. How do you see? How do you interpret this massive shift? Because the EU was supposed to be a peace project, and well, this doesn't feel like peace.
It is a bit of a mystery, I have to say. And I've heard many theories. I've entertained many theories about why Europe is so underperforming. Uh, but I have to say, it is still, to some extent, inexplicable to me. Europe, by many standards, has the highest quality of life in the world, uh, longest life expectancy, extremely low poverty rates, high social protection, much leisure time, uh, sophisticated economies and workforce. So, as you said, looking 25 years ago, it looked like Europe had the right model, and it had the capacity to not only continue with that model, but to share it with the rest of the world. I thought Europe would lead diplomatically in promoting the vision of quality of life and a good social basis, low inequalities, high living standards to other parts of the world. But today, Europe is dysfunctional. It's politically dysfunctional. It's organizationally dysfunctional. The economy is, as you said, sputtering because of the self-imposed costs that Europe has put on itself during this Ukraine war. Well, why is this? On the one side, I think it's right to argue the leadership across Europe is generally rather miserable. That's not my assessment. That's the assessment of the electorates. There's hardly a popular figure anywhere in Europe. Typically, European leaders have approval ratings of maybe 25%, disapproval ratings well over 50%. Some parts don't know or don't care, but basically, these are leaders that do not have approval of the populations. It's generally the case that the more that they have been warmongering, the less approval they have. So leaders like Macron and Starmer, who have been in the forefront of the Ukraine war, are the least popular of all. The populations are saying, we want peace, we want diplomacy, we don't want the war. We don't want these sanctions regimes which just boomerang on us, but the leaders persist. Not only do they persist obsessively. I think the main job of a European leader these days is to meet with Zelensky. Meet with Zelensky in the morning, meet with Zelensky in the afternoon, fly someplace to meet with Zelensky in the evening, fly to another city, meet with Zelensky again. It seems they don't have day jobs. This is their almost sole activity. Where does this come from? It is, I think, Glenn, not glibly explicable, not easily explicable. Some people say, well, uh, it's it's the big business of war, and most of the countries have war industries that are fueling this. Maybe. I think there's something to this. I think one of the things that is true is that much of European politics is really deep state intelligence agency politics. This has been true in the United States. The CIA ran foreign policy in the United States for a very long time, or at least one could say it was the repository of the sustained foreign policy for a very long time. It created the long-term projects. And we know the CIA, MI6, BND, DGSE in France and so forth work very closely together. We had a report today that the head of the French spy agency told the head of Telegram to block accounts of opposition voices in Romania, for example. We know that there is a lot of security agency work. The security agencies have basically been in a war against Russia for decades. This has been their project. That continues, and it seems that many of these so-called political leaders are not leaders at all. They're kind of factotums of the security state apparatus. So I have to confess, I don't have an absolute clear view. And I'll tell you one thing that's interesting from this perspective in my mind. When Tucker Carlson had his interview with President Putin that was so widely watched, and he asked President Putin, why is the German government behaving the way that it is? It was the one time that Putin said, I don't really understand why. I don't get it. He also couldn't come up with an explanation. But I would say, just to put a bottom line on this, European leadership has been miserable, unpopular, a failure from a strategic point of view. It continues to be so until today. Maybe I'll add one more point on this, which is that Europe is structurally hamstrung as well. Clearly, the European project is a jerry-rigged operation where Europe is essentially still 27 sovereign countries, and to the extent that it is one union, it's a not very representative union. It doesn't have institutions that garner much confidence. It doesn't have leaders of the European Commission that command much respect or that deserve much respect from my point of view in most part. So all of this is to say Europe is lost right now. The warmongering is self-destructive and dangerous. It's obsessive. It's a failure. Exactly why is a little bit hard to say.
Well, the discourse here is kind of strange because, again, I can understand why Putin doesn't understand the Germans. I live here in Europe and I don't understand them anymore either, any of the Europeans, that is, because we have this discourse with the Ukraine war where everyone's saying, well, look at the horrible things that are happening to Ukraine. This is not just, and we all want to help Ukraine. And of course, I'm 100% on board. This is gruesome what's happening. But then they take this concept of helping Ukraine and they fill it up with all these policies which are just leading Ukraine to destruction, and there's nothing you can do, and they keep they thereby reach these conclusions in which weapons are the path to peace and diplomacy and negotiations are treasonous. It seems completely irrelevant that the majority of Ukrainian wants negotiations. If you bring it up, then they will tell you, well, that's Putin propaganda. So how do you counter that argument when they ask, well, why shouldn't Ukraine defend itself? Why shouldn't we support Ukraine? How do you approach this? Because this is what it always comes down to, it appears.
Well, it is very much the question, who's the real friend of Ukraine? 3 years ago, I and you and others said this war should stop at the negotiating table. It nearly did. In the Istanbul process, there was just a few weeks after Russia's invasion of February 24th, 2022, which by itself was not the beginning of the war. The war had started 8 years earlier with the Western-supported coup against the government of Viktor Yanukovych. But in any event, with the escalation that took place on February 24th, 2022, that brought Ukraine to the negotiating table. President Zelensky said, okay, I accept neutrality. That would have been the end of the war. A draft agreement was uh, negotiated. It was essentially close to completion, though there were issues to debate, but that's what negotiations settle. And we have the draft agreement of April 15th, 2022. We know now from many, many sources, and I also had at that point flown to Ankara to hear directly from the Turkish mediators what had happened. Ukraine walked away from the table at the behest of the United States and the UK, who told them, keep fighting. Now, at that moment, I said, this is terrible. What good can come out of that? I hosted a meeting with many analysts that concluded that there needed to be peace based on essentially the terms that had already been identified in the Istanbul process. We were called Putin apologists. We were called haters of Ukraine, enemies of Ukraine. It was exactly the opposite. It was to save Ukraine from further territorial losses, devastating destruction, and mass deaths. That's what it was for. And in fact, what has happened since April 2022, nothing has gone for Ukraine during this period. Ukraine has lost probably well over 1 million people to deaths or severe injuries in this disastrous military situation. Obviously, the destruction has been profound. The losses to Ukrainian society of emigration, depopulation, and everything else have been profound. Nothing has helped Ukraine during this period. Peace would have helped Ukraine. And in the end, Ukraine's going to lose much more territory than it would have lost under the Istanbul process of April 2022. And if the war had been avoided previously by NATO just saying it's not going to enlarge to Ukraine, which would have obviated the entire war, averted the entire war, Ukraine wouldn't have lost essentially any territory going back to February 2014, when the West meddled in a coup, which was a brazen, provocative, typical, stupid act of the U.S. security state with allies in the security apparatus all over Europe. Okay, so who's a friend of Ukraine? The ones that warned them away from this. Again, our colleague and friend John Mearsheimer said that the United States led Ukraine down the primrose path, making all these great promises. We're going to make you a great power and so forth. Just what it told so many other countries, Afghanistan being only one of the more recent examples of that. And it failed predictably. So those of us, you and I and others who said from the beginning, end the conflict, negotiate a settlement, basically stop NATO enlargement. It's a provocation to war. There can't be peace if the United States is breathing down Russia's neck and proposing to put its military bases and missile systems on Russia's border. So a little bit of common sense would have been the best friend for Ukraine.
Well, I've been arguing since at least 2008. If you try to push NATO into Ukraine, then Russia would destroy Ukraine before it allows this to happen.
Absolutely.
For some reason,
as the United States would if Russia or China came anywhere close to American shores with military bases, for God's sake. This is so obvious, Glenn. You've been right. Of course, completely right. From that point forward. And yet it has been a relentless project. And now that Trump is giving an exit ramp and Trump is saying, okay, this is a failed project. This was a bad idea. We see Russia's point of view. They don't want our bases there. We don't want their bases here. Trump is the first one saying straightforwardly that this project of the intelligence communities, this deep state security apparatus was stupid. Trump says it. What do the Europeans do? They meet every single day to try to keep this war going. Unbelievable.
Yeah, there seems that the so-called diplomacy taking place now on the side of the Europeans only has the main objective of trying to pull America back into the war. But it does beg why the question why they're willing to risk so much in this war against Russia, because again, the NATO expansion, including to Ukraine, had the purpose of creating a hegemonic, collective hegemony in Europe. Now that this era of global primacy appears to be coming to an end, you see the US making new adjustments. They're now openly saying they will deprioritize Europe. They will have to pivot a bit away from Europe. Did you see this playing a significant role in the minds of the Europeans? Because there seems to be some panic here that the Americans are leaving us. The Americans are leaving us. On one hand, we see, Trump is the devil. On the other hand, we must outsource our security to Trump as much as possible, so to strengthen the partnership, so the Americans won't leave us. But there's the whole thing, I guess, reeks of a
Yes.
strategic lack of clarity in thinking. But
Well, yes, the main thing that both the US deep state and the European deep state rejected or forgot or blindly refuses to see is that there is an alternative to the NATO being in Ukraine or Russia dominating Ukraine. It's called neutrality. It's called a buffer state. And this arrangement goes back several thousand years. It's throughout human history that when there are major empires or major powers that are in competition with each other, you leave some territory in between that doesn't suffer as a result of that. It just prevents the two sides from clashing in nose to nose. And there's nothing ignominious about neutrality. It's a very smart policy, and it worked extremely well for Sweden and Finland and for Ukraine, while Ukraine was allowed to be neutral, for Austria, for Switzerland. These are not the desperate places in the world. They're the most prosperous places in the world. When you think about the World Happiness Rankings, which I happen to edit, co-edit every year with colleagues, Finland's number one. And yet the Finnish president, Stubb, laughingly said, I have to warn the Ukrainians not to become like Finland. Are you kidding? Finland had phenomenal success as a neutral state. Then, of course, the U.S. security apparatus promoted politicians like Stubb with an American backing who would defend the American-led hegemony and so forth. That was also part of the U.S. game. How do we control politics in every country? But what are the Europeans thinking? Why can't one leader just clearly stand up and say, it would be smarter if Ukraine were neutral? Not Russian, not NATO, just neutral. Not the worst thing in the world, but the best for everybody, because that would keep the wars away from us. Now Europe is in a tizzy. Oh my God, if we don't succeed in Ukraine, Russia's going to be in Paris again. As if this is 1812 and 1815, the Napoleonic Wars, which, by the way, Europe invaded Russia, not the other way around. We should continue to recall. So there's a lot of blindness, a lot of lack of the most basic recognition of reality, the most basic understanding of how we got to this disaster, from the peacemaking of Gorbachev and Yeltsin to outright war, was a U.S. deep state provocation supported by the security apparatus across Europe. Well, Trump has figured this out. Interestingly, and dangerously, he doesn't have uh, full voice in the United States because the U.S. deep state, many neocons, many hardliners continue in the U.S. to try to push for war and run over to Europe and say, let's pull Trump back to good sense to continue the war against Russia. And that's part of the drama right now. Uh, Part of the European delusion is we can win back the United States for continued warmongering. Maybe there are parts of the U.S. security apparatus that are working hand in hand with the Europeans. We know that part of Trump's own team, General Kellogg, Mike Waltz, other hardliners are saying to the Europeans, yes, let's get our terms. The president will come along and so forth. So making peace is not easy when you've had this 30-year project of expanding hegemony, Western hegemony, mainly U.S. hegemony. Trump's trying to stop it. It could be stopped, but we're still waiting for a single, sensible European voice of a major power to tell the truth. There are many in the smaller countries, Viktor Orban or Robert Fico, who are telling the truth. There are candidates in Eastern Europe who are telling the truth or are then cut out of election campaigns and told that they can't stand. But we're waiting for a leader in Germany or France or Britain to tell the truth. Britain will be the last, I think. It always is in this regard. It's the most warmongering of all. Maybe some other European leader will begin to tell the truth.
This is a very quick final question. Do you see any way of reversing any of this? Because, Europe was supposed to develop everything from, green energies and economic leadership. Now we have military Keynesianism. We're gonna be the role model for democracy. Now we're purging the political opposition from France, Germany, Romania, and of course, we used to recognize that security required us to assess the security concerns of our opponents, being it the Chinese, Iranians, Russians. But now, of course, security instead means to fight the world's largest nuclear power. How do you see any exit from this? What would it take? I know that's a big ask, but
Well, no, no, no. I mean, the exit is obvious. It would take rationality, clear thinking. And so it's not far-fetched to believe that views will change because the current views are self-destructive. They are unpopular. They make no sense. And in this sense, the puzzle, of course, is why they continue, not why they would end. So, yes, Europe could come along. The United States could lead that because most likely Trump will persevere in making peace with Russia, ending the U.S. engagement in Ukraine, and for all practical purposes, that's the end of any possibility of Ukraine continuing to fight this war, no matter what the warmongers in Europe say. So this war is going to end. It's going to end either at the negotiating table or it's going to end through Ukraine's defeat at Russia's hands. But it's not going to end the way that Starmer, Macron, Merz, and others are portraying that Russia will be defeated. So in this sense, there will be a new kind of realism. Can Europe rise above that mere fact and actually understand its strategic situation better? Could it understand that rather than $800 billion of rearming, so-called, it ought to spend a plane ticket, fly to Moscow and open some negotiations and some diplomacy? Or if it doesn't want to spend a plane ticket, invite Russian leaders to meet with them someplace else. In other words, diplomacy would be a lot cheaper, a lot more successful, a lot less painful than the course that the Europeans are set on right now. as far as I know, not one European leader of the major countries or the European Commission is in any kind of diplomacy with Russia. Now, occasionally they beg the United States, oh, please let us be at the table. It's not fair. We're not at the table. This is pathetic, to say the least. If Europe wants to negotiate with Russia, pick up a phone, dial a Zoom, fly to Moscow, invite Foreign Minister Lavrov to a meeting someplace. For heaven's sake, don't beg the United States. Open diplomacy. So, yes, it's of course possible for Europe to change. And if Europe gets off the warmongering, maybe it will reconsider its longer term strategic position as well. Because actually, strangely enough, I believe in an effective Europe, but more Europe if it's effective, if it represents the real interests of the European population. Because in an era of major powers of the US and Russia and China and India and so forth, Europe needs to be there, not as 27 quarrelsome, belligerent, warmongering states, but as Europe. That would be very good for Europe. But under the current situation, unfortunately, the Commission is neither effective nor representative, nor serving Europe's interests. So there needs to be more fundamental reform. But in the short term, there needs to be peace.
Yes, as a European living here, it's devastating to see the way it's run. But well, Professor
Agreed.
Sachs, it's always a great pleasure. So thank you again for your time.
See you again soon. Thanks.